Have you ever noticed something strange about world history? There are certain civilizations that seem to explode with energy, creativity, science, philosophy, and power almost overnight. Then, somehow, that same civilization slows down, fragments, or loses the momentum that once made it unstoppable. And when we look at the history of the Islamic world, this question becomes impossible to ignore. How did a movement that began in the deserts of Arabia eventually produce some of the greatest mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, philosophers, architects, and scholars the world has ever seen? How did societies connected to Islam become centers of knowledge, while much of Europe was struggling through political fragmentation and instability? And perhaps the biggest question of all, if the Islamic world once stood at the forefront of human civilization, what changed? Guys, this is where the story becomes far more interesting than most people realize. Because the answer is not simply religion. The answer is not simply economics. And it is definitely not a story that can be explained through a single event. To understand what happened, we have to travel back to a world that looked completely different from our own. Imagine the 7th century. The Middle East was not some isolated region sitting on the edge of civilization. It was actually located at the crossroads of the known world. To the west stood the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome. To the east stood the Persian Empire, one of the most powerful states on earth. For generations, these two giants fought enormous wars against each other. Think about the consequences. Wars consume resources. Wars destroy economies. Wars exhaust populations. Wars weaken governments. And after decades of conflict, both empires were exhausted. This is important, very important, because history often teaches the same lesson. Great powers usually do not collapse because an enemy suddenly becomes strong. They collapse because they become weak first. Now think about that. When existing powers are exhausted, space opens for new ideas, new movements, and new political forces. That is exactly the environment in which the early Islamic community emerged. Many historians argue that timing played a major role. The region was already experiencing political instability, economic disruption, and widespread dissatisfaction. People were searching for certainty. They were searching for purpose. They were searching for something that could unify fragmented societies. And this is where a broader perspective becomes useful. Throughout history, successful civilizations rarely win because of military power alone. Military victories often come later. First comes the idea. First comes the vision. First comes the ability to convince people that they belong to something larger than themselves. Look at the Roman Empire. Look at China under major dynasties. Look at the rise of modern nation-states. The pattern repeats again and again. People unite around powerful stories. The early Islamic movement provided exactly that. It offered a framework that connected spiritual belief with social organization, law, community, and governance. For many people, that combination was extraordinarily attractive. Now here is where things become fascinating. Modern discussions often focus on conquest. But conquest alone never explains long-term success. Think about it. History is full of conquerors. Most disappeared. Most left little lasting impact. The real question is not how territory was acquired. The real question is how societies were built afterward. And this is where the Islamic world demonstrated something remarkable. As territories expanded, networks expanded, trade expanded, knowledge expanded, ideas expanded. Cities became connected through routes stretching from Spain to Central Asia, from North Africa to India, and eventually beyond. For the first time, enormous regions were linked by commercial, cultural, and intellectual exchange. Imagine being a merchant, a scholar, or an engineer in such a system. Knowledge could travel thousands of miles. Books could travel thousands of miles. Mathematics could travel thousands of miles. Scientific discoveries could travel thousands of miles. This created something incredibly powerful, a civilization connected by information. And whenever information moves efficiently, innovation follows. Always. Look at today's world. The internet accelerated innovation because information moves rapidly. The Islamic Golden Age benefited from a similar principle. Information flowed across continents. Scholars translated works from Greek, Persian, Indian, and other traditions. Instead of destroying knowledge, many intellectual centers preserved it. Instead of rejecting foreign ideas outright, many thinkers absorbed them. This is one reason why cities such as Baghdad became legendary. These were not simply political capitals. They became knowledge capitals. And knowledge is power. Not military power, not political power, civilizational power. The power to shape how future generations understand the world. Now think about something else. Many people imagine history as a competition between civilizations. But reality is often more complicated. Civilizations learn from each other constantly. The Islamic world inherited knowledge from older traditions. Europe later benefited from knowledge preserved and developed within the Islamic world. Scientific concepts traveled, mathematical systems traveled, philosophical debates traveled, medical knowledge traveled. Civilizations are less like isolated islands and more like connected rivers. Ideas keep flowing. This is why simplistic narratives usually fail. History is rarely about one group winning and another group losing. History is usually about networks of influence interacting over centuries. Now let's address another important question. Why did intellectual activity flourish so dramatically? One explanation offered by many scholars is competition. Competition is not always military. Competition can be intellectual, political, economic, cultural. Different cities competed for prestige. Different rulers competed for influence. Different scholars competed for recognition. And when competition exists, innovation often follows. Think about modern technology companies. Why do they innovate? Because rivals exist. Now imagine that same principle applied to scholarship. If one city produced brilliant mathematicians, another city wanted to do the same. If one ruler sponsored scientific research, another ruler wanted comparable achievements. This created incentives for learning, and learning creates momentum. Momentum creates breakthroughs. Breakthroughs create prosperity. Prosperity attracts talent. Talent creates more breakthroughs. It's a cycle, a powerful cycle. But here's where the story takes a surprising turn, because the very factors that create success can eventually create vulnerability. Does that make sense? History is filled with this paradox. Strength becomes weakness. Success creates complacency. Victory creates rigidity. Institutions designed for one era struggle to adapt to another. Some analysts suggest that this happened in many great civilizations. Not only within the Islamic world, the Roman Empire experienced it. Imperial China experienced it. European colonial powers experienced it. Even modern powers face the same risk. The challenge is adaptation. Can a civilization continue reinventing itself, or does it become trapped by its own success? Now think about innovation. Innovation requires stability, but it also requires disruption. Too much chaos destroys creativity. Too much stability can also reduce creativity. Civilizations need balance, and maintaining that balance is incredibly difficult. As political structures become more established, institutions naturally become protective. They seek stability. They seek continuity. They seek order. Those goals are understandable, but sometimes excessive emphasis on preservation can reduce flexibility. And flexibility matters, because the world keeps changing. Technology changes, economics changes, trade routes change, power balances change, environmental conditions change, demographics change. A civilization that fails to adapt eventually faces challenges. This is true everywhere, not just in one region, not just in one religion, everywhere. Now let's zoom out even further. While parts of the Islamic world were achieving extraordinary intellectual success, Europe was undergoing a very different experience. Political fragmentation was common. Many regions experienced instability. Knowledge networks were weaker than they would later become. Economic development varied dramatically. Yet history never stands still. Eventually, Europe began changing. Universities expanded. Trade expanded. States consolidated power. Technological innovation accelerated. Printing transformed information distribution. Oceanic exploration opened entirely new economic systems. And suddenly the balance began shifting. Here is where it gets interesting. Europe's rise was not simply Europe's achievement, nor was it solely the decline of others. It was the result of multiple historical processes interacting simultaneously. Global trade routes shifted. Political structures evolved. Scientific methods matured. Financial institutions became more sophisticated. Military technologies changed. Everything was moving at once. History rarely provides single causes. Instead, it produces combinations of causes. Imagine trying to identify one reason why a forest grows. You can't. Rain matters, soil matters, temperature matters, sunlight matters, time matters. History works the same way. Now let's bring this discussion into the modern world, because this is not merely a story about the past, it is also a story about the future. Look around today. The world is entering another period of transformation. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, automation, geopolitical competition, supply chain restructuring, energy transitions. These forces are reshaping the global system. And once again, nations face the same question civilizations have faced for thousands of years. Can they adapt? Think about it. The countries that dominate the 21st century may not necessarily be the strongest today. They may simply be the most adaptable, the most innovative, the most capable of learning, the most capable of integrating new ideas. This lesson appears repeatedly throughout history. The Islamic Golden Age demonstrates it. Europe's later rise demonstrates it. Modern technological revolutions demonstrate it. Knowledge matters. Institutions matter. Adaptation matters. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: no civilization possesses a permanent monopoly on success. None. History has never worked that way. Power moves, wealth moves, innovation moves, leadership moves. The center of gravity shifts again and again. What seems impossible in one century becomes inevitable in the next. What appears permanent often proves temporary. And that reality should make us cautious whenever we hear simplistic explanations. Civilizations do not rise because of one factor. Civilizations do not decline because of one factor. Reality is always more complicated. Always. When we examine the rise of the Islamic world, we see geography, trade, ideas, institutions, leadership, scholarship, and historical timing interacting together. When we examine Europe's later ascent, we see another complex combination of factors. And when we examine today's world, we should expect the same complexity. Because history never repeats itself exactly, but it often rhymes. The societies that encourage learning tend to outperform those that suppress it. The societies that connect themselves to global networks tend to gain advantages over those that isolate themselves. The societies capable of questioning old assumptions often discover new opportunities. And the societies that become convinced their dominance is guaranteed often discover that history has other plans. Now think about that for a moment. The real story is not Islam versus Europe. The real story is how civilizations manage knowledge, how they organize institutions, how they respond to change, how they balance tradition with innovation. Because every generation inherits the same challenge: preserve what works, improve what doesn't, and adapt before circumstances force adaptation upon you. That challenge existed in 7th century Arabia. It existed in medieval Baghdad. It existed in Renaissance Europe. And it exists right now. Which means the most important question is not what happened 1,000 years ago. The most important question is whether modern societies are learning the lessons that history keeps trying to teach. Because the next golden age may belong to whoever understands those lessons first.